Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is brought to us by James Gunn, written and directed, and also brought to us by Marvel Studios, and is the final installment of the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, the story of which has been covering a 9-year time span if you include their appearances in Infinity War and Endgame. Now it's all coming to a head in a really darker and more somber installment this time around. Ever since Avengers Endgame, people have been very lukewarm and so-so with the MCU, minus a couple of exceptions. I think with No Way Home, a lot of people almost unanimously love that movie, and Wakanda Forever, I would say, is probably considered second best, at least before this movie came out, as far as the films go anyway. I don't really agree with a lot of the consensus that's out there on Phase 4 and some of Phase 5 at least. I think that Phase 4 has been really solid, minus a couple of issues here and there. I think the MCU has been doing just fine, even if they have some bumps along the way. You can say whatever you want about certain movies, but I still think that they have a lot to offer. And based on what we see in this movie, I would not call it quits on the MCU just yet. Some people already have, and that's fine if they are. I just realized I need to move over so you can see the other two. This right behind me. Yesterday I just moved the camera. I am really tired right now. I had a crazy weekend. A lot's been going on. Also been trying to absorb my thoughts on Guardians Volume 3, so just bear with me here. I'm going to try to get my thoughts out as best as I can. And I'm going to be talking about some details that are somewhat spoilerific. Not going to talk about everything, but if you don't want to know anything, just be warned. The big emotional focus is the backstory of Rocket Raccoon and how he came to be the way he is, shedding light on some of the things he said in the previous 2 movies or what other characters said to him, like with Yondu talking about how they were the same since they were abandoned and created in some ways by scientists or experimented on, and Rocket's tantrum in the first film, how he was reassembled and put back together, hits a lot more differently now having seen this one. This movie reveals that he was experimented on by a man called the High Evolutionary, who saw something that he would see fit as a way to improve animalistic behavior and make them more human-like. As we see it, they go into a reverse Earth of some kind. I forget the name of the Earth, but it's basically a mirror or parallel image of what we know as planet Earth. We get to see the friends that he made while he was being held in captivity, Teeths, the walrus Floor, the rabbit with the metal clamp over its face, and Lila the otter, voiced by Linda Cardellini, who's also Hawkeye's wife. The film starts off on a very somber note, as opposed to the previous 2 openings, while the opening title sequences that are very upbeat and exciting, like with Star-Lord's dance number to Come Get Your Love, or Baby Groot's dance moves to Mr. Blue Sky by ELO. We don't see any of that in the opening credits of this one. It's just Rocket sitting on a ledge, thinking about various things, possibly what he experienced in the past. But then later he's attacked by a character named Adam Warlock, played by Will Poulter, more on that guy later. And in their efforts to revive him, they find out that they have to get some kind of a kill switch in order to wake him back up without killing him. As you'd expect from somebody like James Gunn, the weirdness is on full display in this one, as well as its self-awareness, but it also knows when to take itself seriously, when it's required, especially with Rocket's backstory. And I was very relieved that James Gunn didn't play it up for a joke, which I didn't think he would in the first place, but how he was able to handle this through his writing and directing of certain scenes, where we see how Rocket's intelligence was able to exceed the High Evolutionary's intelligence and how he got jealous of that, and how he was tortured severely when we see this one hologram image as the Guardians are looking through this archive footage, and it all finally starts to click with them why he is the way he is. And not to get too deep into this kind of message, I think it really goes to show you that you never really know what somebody's gone through. Somebody's quirks or behavioral tendencies, it all comes back to something in their past, one way or another. I really like how we get to see that each member of the team is in their own unique place. Mantis is not afraid to stand up for herself as opposed to being a pushover in the previous films. Drax actually has somewhat more legitimate stuff to do other than just be a joke character, which I'm not opposed to that at all considering how literal he takes everything. Nebula is still her angry self, but I would say she's a little bit more controlled in how she approaches things, and she almost is kind of like the way Gamora was when we first met her in the first Guardians, whereas the Gamora that we see here, which is an alternate reality, she is more like the Nebula that we first met in Guardians Volume 1. Similar to how Marty and Doc Brown in the Back to the Future trilogy were reversed by the time Part 3 came out. Marty was messing up the timeline, Doc was trying to keep him in line, and then with Part 3, when he meets Clara, Marty's the one trying to keep Doc in line. It's not something we haven't seen before, but when it's done correctly, I think it can really benefit a piece of media. I wasn't really sure how Gamora was going to fit into this, considering that she was an alternate reality. This isn't the same Gamora if you've seen Infinity Infinity War, you'll know exactly how that went down. But with her place in this one, I think it made a whole lot of sense. Everything she knew is completely gone, thanks to the disruption of the timeline. Now she's joined the Ravagers, led by Sylvester Stallone's character, which I guess would make sense for her to find some kind of sense of belonging in a world where everybody's trying to pick up the pieces of what happened 5 years prior, or 5+ years prior, I guess. Yeah, I don't know exactly when in the timeline this happens, but I know it's the post-Endgame era, in the MCU at least. Chris Pratt, as usual, is really funny and has that Han Solo quality that we all like to see. There's some stuff with him that I was hoping that we would get a little more light on, where he tends to get himself drunk into a stupor. It doesn't really get touched on though, but after a while I just shrugged it off and moved on. But I also really like the payoff that he gets when he has this conversation with Mantis, or when Mantis tries to talk to him about his family back home on Earth. She's asking him, hey, don't you remember your grandfather? Maybe he was protecting you from seeing your mother's dead body in the bed. And he brushes it off saying, no, he was a pretty tough guy. Just threw me out of the room like it was nothing. And if you've seen the holiday special, which I have, given that Mantis is Star-Lord's sister, at least through his biological father, Ego. Something that I guess a good sister would try to do, keep their sibling grounded in reality somewhat and try to help them see, no, actually, you thought about it this way for so long, maybe it's actually this way. And just a little FYI, I do plan on reviewing the holiday special later this year. I meant to do it last year, but just the timing didn't really work out. Eventually, later this year, I will get it up for you. As usual, the movie looks and sounds really good, with the soundtrack never really disappoints. It didn't disappoint the first 2 times, and it certainly doesn't do that in this one. Visually, it's really cool to look at. Seeing this in IMAX, seeing all the little imperfections and details on all the animals. For anyone who's a sucker for visual effects, this is the perfect treat for you. The color palette is a little bit more, I guess, in the line of like the Russo brothers with Civil War and Endgame. It's a little bit more grayish in its color, I would say. And I guess given the somber tone, it doesn't really surprise me. I'm not complaining. I totally understand why they did that. As for the High Evolutionary, his motives, I would say, are mostly clear to understand, because he sees something in Earth that he believed was wrong, and he wanted to correct it and make a better Earth out of it. But he just kind of comes off as really hammy and doesn't really have much depth to him. Granted, the villains in the Guardians of the Galaxy don't really have a whole lot of that kind of stuff, so I wasn't really surprised. This is a space opera where it's good guys versus bad guys, so you kind of just have to take it for what it is. I also really like that we get a mini arc with Kraglin, who's played by Sean Gunn. I finally remember the character's name. He basically becomes the new Yondu. He shaved his head and has the fin on top of his head, and he's trying to figure out how to use the arrow that Yondu would use whenever he whistles. Doesn't really go so well in the one mid-credit scene of Volume 2, if you've seen it. But inevitably, he manages to figure out how to use it when he remembers what Yondu said at one point in the second movie, that he uses his heart, or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But we do get a glimpse of Yondu, and I guess it's an uncredited appearance from Michael Rooker. You can't have a Guardians movie and not have him be involved still in some capacity. Then when he finally gets to use the arrow, nothing more than a deep feeling of satisfaction. That's all I'll say. And the dog, Cosmo, who agonizes over the fact of being called a bad dog. Okay, I don't care what anyone says. That gets me even more than Baby Groot. Or Baby Yoda, Grogu. Yep, I said it. It's out of the way. Speaking of the animals, a lot of people have talked about the animal cruelty aspect of this whole thing. It's not nearly as bad as I initially thought, because I heard a lot about it going in. It's definitely present though. I was able to tolerate it for the most part, but with the rabbit Floor having that metal thing over her face, once I started to really focus on that, I found myself wincing. I think that was the intention, to kind of get the point across that this is a definitely more darker movie than you would expect from a Guardians movie. And I think James Gunn made a really bold move in doing that, and it's one that I think really paid off. Not just taking a risk just for the sake of taking a risk. Oh yeah, and we get our first F-bomb in a Marvel movie. An MCU movie, I should say. If this was Deadpool, the chances of hearing an F-bomb would be a lot higher. Hearing Chris Pratt drop it, the whole theater was just either laughing or applauding. And I'm surprised that James Gunn was able to get away with that. Mind you, it was just one. I mean, it's not exactly the days of the 1980s with planes, trains, and automobiles, and Steve Martin just unloads an F-bomb after another to the point where it has to be rated R. But it's that, along with the gruesome imagery that we see in the climax of the movie. Not to be too specific about it, but it almost has a very body horror type of feel from the likes of David Cronenberg or John Carpenter. And I guess you could say in a way it kind of reminded me of Two-Face in The Dark Knight, where we don't really see his skin on the half of his face that was burnt off, and like Gustavo Fring's death in Breaking Bad. Not too much focus on it because some kids are probably going to want to go see this, but for that stuff and the animal cruelty aspect of it all, to any parents out there, if you're wondering if you should bring your kids to this, you might want to give them a warning on that one. Just read up the IMDb content rating stuff. That'll tell you whether or not you should see it. Will Poulter as Adam Warlock? I was a little iffy on him. He was alright. He didn't really have a whole lot to do, though. I'm not the first person to say that. This is an introduction to him, so I wasn't that surprised by it. Seeing how he interacts with everybody and how he does certain things to the extreme, taking things literally, I guess you could say it's kind of like Drax. Doesn't really know how to interact with people or how to approach certain things appropriately. And I would imagine that we're probably going to see him develop more as time goes on. This is more like an introduction, so I understand that you can't really go full depth into what he is as a person. But I do like that he does get to save Star-Lord at the climax when it looks like that Star-Lord might actually die, giving Peter the opportunity to go back home and see his grandfather who's still alive, which that's the moment I think he needed. And it literally made me start to cry. That moment, along with Rocket's backstory, it was hard not to get emotional during those moments. And of course, there's Groot. He's just there to be the dog of the group. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. He's just there for the cute factor or the adorable factor. He's more like a young adult type of Groot, I would say, given his size and maturity level, not the teenage Groot that we saw in Infinity War. I am Groot. Oh! Got some acorns on you, kid. But there is a moment where we finally get to hear him say something different instead of, I am Groot or we are Groot. They addressed it in the first movie, but I like that Gamora starts to say, are you sure that you're understanding what he's saying and you're not just pretending to? But when he says, I love you guys, I sat there and I literally went like this. My God! I don't know if that was him actually developing his speech skills, or maybe it was just us, the audience, finally getting to understand what he was saying this whole time, or at least part of what he was saying. As for the mid and post-credit scenes, there's not really a whole lot of big teases in here. It's just a new set of Guardians that are going on their usual missions with the song Come Get Your Love, but I guess it's something that you could say will play an important factor in future movies going forward. And the last one that we get is Star-Lord having breakfast with his grandpa in Missouri, and we get one last font saying Star-Lord will return or something like that. Obviously, this is not the last time that we're going to see any of these characters, so probably going to show up again in some shape or form. I doubt that we're going to see a Guardians Volume 5, 6, and 7, and 8 or whatever. But as far as like the team-ups with the Secret Wars stuff, I wouldn't be surprised if they showed up again there in some capacity. And I was actually surprised that nobody died in this one. At least not the main characters anyway. I was fairly certain for a while that Rocket was going to bite the big one. That he was going to make some big sacrifice given all the stuff that he's gone through. Or seeing Star-Lord almost die when he was out there in space. And then I saw the hand from off screen and it was Adam Warlock. I thought, oh, of course. Why would they do that? I don't know about everybody else, but I was okay with it. If I had to say how would I feel about this movie in comparison to the other two, if you rank this in the emotional category, this is probably the best one. But as far as an overall movie, I would probably say it's ever so slightly right behind Volume 1. I do like Volume 2, but I wasn't like crazy about it as I was with the first one. And the first one, I mean, it's hard to really top that movie's success because it was so unexpected. Nobody thought anyone was going to take that movie seriously, similar to the first Iron Man in some respects. But this one, I think, comes really, really close. The darker tone and vibe might play into somewhat of a rewatchability factor for me, but there's still a lot of good fun to be had in here, so take from that what you will. Oh, and this moment that we see here in the trailer, it's just as funny in the movie.
It sounds more like her.
Her? That's ridiculous.
Do not bring me into this.
Knock it off!
What?
Those are my thoughts on Guardians Volume 3. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are, and I'll see you guys in the next one.